You know what's fascinating about history? Sometimes the most consequential invasions happen without a single tank crossing a border. Right now, as we speak, China is executing what might be the most audacious territorial expansion of the 21st century, and most people have no idea it's even happening. We're talking about outer Manchuria and Siberia, millions of square miles that once belonged to the Qing dynasty before Russia seized them in what the Chinese still call the unequal treaties of the 1850s and 1860s. And here's the kicker: China is taking them back, not with missiles or military parades, but with migration, economic colonization, and strategic patience, all while maintaining the charade of being Russia's strategic partner. Let me paint you a picture of what's actually happening on the ground. The Russian Far East is dying. I don't mean that metaphorically. I mean the population is literally collapsing. The entire region, which is roughly twice the size of Western Europe, has fewer than 8 million people. That's less than the population of New York City spread across an area larger than the European Union. Birth rates are catastrophic. Young people are fleeing to Moscow and St. Petersburg, and whole towns are turning into ghost settlements. Now look across the border. China's northeastern provinces, Heilongjiang, Jilin, and Liaoning, have over 100 million people. The population pressure is like a dam ready to burst, and that dam has been quietly cracking for decades. Chinese migrants have been flowing into Siberia for years, starting as traders and seasonal workers, then becoming permanent settlers. They're farming the land that Russians have abandoned, running the businesses that keep the border towns functioning, and creating entire economic ecosystems that run on renminbi, not rubles. Russian officials know this. They've watched Chinese farmers lease massive tracts of land, ostensibly for agriculture, but creating de facto Chinese settlements in the process. They've seen Chinese companies become the dominant economic force in cities that were built as Russian military outposts. And they're terrified, even if they won't say it publicly. But the demographic shift is just beginning. China has systematically made Russia's Far East economically dependent on Chinese capital, Chinese infrastructure, and Chinese markets. This isn't cooperation, it's colonization with a smile. Chinese companies now control critical infrastructure throughout Siberia. They're creating the roads, the railways, the power plants. They're funding development projects that the Russian government can't afford. And with each investment, they're buying leverage, creating dependencies that will be impossible to unwind. The natural resources are where this really gets sinister. Siberia has some of the world's largest reserves of timber, minerals, oil, and natural gas. And who's extracting them? Increasingly, it's Chinese companies, on terms that heavily favor Beijing. Russia is essentially strip mining its own territory and shipping the proceeds to China at bargain basement prices, all because Putin needs China's economic support to sustain his regime under Western sanctions. Look at the power of Siberia Pipeline, a massive natural gas line running from Siberian fields to China. Russia has spent billions building it. Russia locked itself into a 30-year contract and gave China prices so favorable that some analysts question whether Russia even makes money on the deal. China gets guaranteed energy security. Russia just gets enough revenue to keep the lights on. That's not a partnership of equals. That's a protection racket. Here's where the China Hawks case gets really damning. China claims Russia is its strategic partner, united against American hegemony, bound together by their shared vision of a multipolar world. Xi Jinping and Putin meet regularly, smile for cameras, and issue joint statements about their friendship without limits. But look at what China actually does. When Russia invaded Ukraine, China didn't provide the military support Putin desperately needed. They made sympathetic noises, refused to condemn Russia at the UN, and then sat back and watched Russia burn through its military stockpiles and economic reserves. Why? Because a weakened Russia is useful to China, a Russia that's isolated from the West, hemorrhaging resources, and increasingly desperate for any economic partnership it can find. That's a Russia that will accept Chinese terms for everything. This is betrayal dressed up as friendship. China is doing to Russia exactly what it accuses the West of doing, treating it as a junior partner, exploiting its weakness, and pursuing its own interests while paying lip service to solidarity. The difference is that Western countries at least argue about their relationships in public. China just smiles, nods, and quietly tightens the noose. Chinese officials occasionally let the mask slip. Academics in Beijing write papers about lost territories of outer-Manchuria. Textbooks show maps of the Qing dynasty at its greatest extent, with borders that extend deep into what is now Russian Siberia. The message is subtle but clear. We haven't forgotten and we haven't forgiven. The Communist Party doesn't need to publicly demand the return of these territories. They just need to create the conditions where, in a generation or two, the region is so thoroughly Chinese in population, economy, and culture that the borders become a historical footnote. Why fight a war when you can win through demographics and economics? When it comes to Russia, they've been thinking decades ahead, while other countries think in election cycles. And right now, the board is set for a historic shift in the balance of power in Northeast Asia, one that will make Russia's eastern territories Chinese in everything but name. What makes this so devastating for Russia is that they have no good options. They can't stop Chinese migration without destroying their economy. Those Chinese workers and businesses are the only thing keeping the Far East alive. They can't reduce economic dependence on China without access to Western markets and technology, which are closed off due to sanctions. And they can't militarily confront China even if they wanted to. Not when their military is bogged down in Ukraine and China has a military that dwarfs Russia's conventional forces. Putin's entire foreign policy has been built on the idea that partnering with China gives Russia strategic depth against the West. But he's made Russia dependent on a neighbor that has historical claims to Russian territory, a population 30 times larger, and an economy 10 times more powerful. That's not strategic depth. That's strategic suicide in slow motion. If China succeeds in the silent reconquest, it will fundamentally reshape global geopolitics. Russia, the largest country on Earth by territory, will effectively lose control of its eastern third. China will secure direct access to the Arctic, vast natural resources, and strategic depth that makes it virtually impossible to contain militarily. And the message to the rest of the world will be clear. China doesn't need to fight wars to expand its power. It just needs patience, economic leverage, and a willingness to exploit every weakness in its neighbors, even those who consider themselves allies. This is the future that China hawks warn about. A world where Beijing's influence expands not through conquest, but through economic colonization, demographic displacement, and systemic exploitation of weaker states. And it's happening right now. In the vast emptiness of Siberia, the world watches Ukraine and the South China Sea and misses the bigger picture. The question isn't whether China is taking back outer Manchuria and Siberia. The question is whether anyone will notice before it's too late to matter. Because if this demographic and economic transformation continues for another generation, the maps will change without a single shot being fired. And Russia's erstwhile ally will have pulled off one of the greatest territorial acquisitions in modern history, all while maintaining the fiction of friendship. That's the reality that should terrify anyone paying attention to the rise of Chinese power. They don't need to be aggressive when they can be patient. They don't need to invade when they can simply wait for their neighbors to collapse under their own weight. And they don't need to honor their partnerships when those partnerships can be exploited for strategic gain. Welcome to the new era of great power competition. The borders are changing, but the armies are staying home.